Well, hi everyone. It's great to be here, and thanks to the organisers for the opportunity to update you on 10 years of research from the Lambert Initiative. If I could have the first slide, please. Thanks very much. It seems like yesterday, actually, but apparently we're 10 years old. And our mission during that time has been to develop novel cannabinoid-based therapeutics to alleviate human suffering. In some ways, we've only really done that in the last year. We'd had 9 years of all sorts of strange distractions and drug policy stuff and clinical trials that I never actually anticipated. I thought we'd be not a big pharma, but a wee pharma, and discover all these new medicines. And that's happening now, but it was a very circuitous path. We have a number of things to be proud of. In the last 10 years, we've trained and employed more than 100 people, trained them up in cannabis science, which is terrific for Australia. A lot of these people have gone into industry or become academics themselves, so we're proud of that. 15 PhDs completed, more than 200 peer-reviewed international publications, and I've met more politicians than I probably would have liked to. Although the recent batch of legalized cannabis guys are all pretty good. We do a lot of medical legal work, lending our expertise to often pro bono in cases where people are up on charges due to their medicinal cannabis use. Done lots of surveys of patients, consumers, and health professionals, and more than 25 clinical trials of cannabinoid products. And probably what's most exciting for the boffins is more than 1,000 new molecules that we've developed that are inspired by compounds that are found in the cannabis plant. And that's our current team, or most of them anyway, at our Christmas party in December. There's about 25 of us at the moment, and they're a very brainy bunch that I'm very fortunate to lead. In this talk, I'll give you a little bit of history, how the Lambert Initiative arrived, highlight 2 or 3 of our community-based studies that I think have had a major impact, and some of our standout clinical trials. I'll ask the question, is low-dose CBD a waste of time? Because that's something that's occupied quite a bit of our time researching. And then into driving and workplace impairment, which has been an area where we've been very active. And then to end, I'll tell you about some of these exciting new molecules that are coming down through the pipe. So I started out my academic career getting rats stoned and showing that bad things happened in their brain when you gave them THC. And the reason for that was not because I thought THC was bad, it was because the only way you could get research funding was to show that it did something bad. And along the way I met Jonathan Arnold. He was one of my first PhD students, and he's still a partner in crime. Not crime really, partner in science, let's say that. And we always wanted one of these. This is a mass spectrometer, because we thought, our research with rats would be so much better if we could measure THC levels in their brains and their blood and so on. So eventually we managed to land funding for a Shimadzu GCMS. And then when we got that, we realized actually we can use this to analyze cannabis. So we paired up with Wendy Swift and started analyzing police-seized cannabis. And it was hilarious. We'd have the police arrive at the lab every morning with huge bags full of weed and just hand them over, and we would get to analyze the THC content. And the answer was basically 15% back there in 2013 with very little CBD. But that got us into plant analysis. And then on the clinical side, the only way you could get funding back then was to get people off cannabis rather than putting them on cannabis. So we paired up with Nick, Dave, and the late Jan Copeland to help them in their first trial of what you might call cannabinoid substitution. So people withdrawing from cannabis were given Sativex, the oral mucosal spray, and to see whether that helped them smoothly come off cannabis. And that was actually the first clinical trial of a cannabinoid product in Australia, and it was a great opportunity to get to know Nick and Dave. And then my life changed when I got this email in 2014 from Lucy Haslam, inviting me to go to the first UIC symposium up there in Tamworth. She'd seen me on the telly, and I met Dan and learned her story and her indignation that she risked arrest and prosecution for giving this medicine to her desperately ill son. And so I went up with Nick and Dave Alsop and Tom Arkell, And Mike Baird opened the UIC in 2014. And then at the conference dinner, we met Michael Lambert, who told us a story of his desperately epileptic Caitlin, his daughter, who had Dravet syndrome, and how he was breaking the law to give her cannabinoid products that gave her a remarkable alleviation of her symptoms. And we got to know Caitlin and Michael quite well. There's Dave with Caitlin, and eventually got to know the grandparents, who happened to be high net worth individuals and pledged an enormous amount of money to set up the Lambert Initiative at the University of Sydney. It was like winning the scientific lottery, and there was a huge amount of euphoria, and then the realization that we actually had to do something. And universities are not always the best place to get stuff done. The processes tend to move very slowly, so it was a full couple of years before we were properly set up. I'll probably lose my job over this slide, but it took a while for us to get laboratories and get the team together, but it's been pretty good since 2017. One of the major setbacks was our loss of Dave Alsop in 2018 to an aggressive cancer. That was unforeseen, and I think I miss Dave just about every day of my life. He was a real unique character and quite a brilliant scientist, and set the Lambert Initiative on the path that it followed. So, as I said earlier, it wasn't a straight line. There was all sorts of interesting adventures and loopy bits and sidetracks, but there's probably about 1 million laughs as well. We have a lot of fun at the Lambert Initiative. There's a lot of joking around. Barry and Joy remain good friends, and Caitlin has grown up very well. She continues to use cannabis-based medicines. This is a photo of her in 2025, living up in Bellingen, and she's doing very well as a young teenager with Dravet syndrome. So she's a testament to the efficacy of cannabis-based medicines for people with pediatric epilepsies. Okay, so some of our greatest hits that I can tell you about. Let's start with some community and survey work. The Pelican study was a standout study that we did in the first couple of years of the Lambert Initiative, and that involved going out into the community at a time when it was really hard to access legal medicinal cannabis, and working with the parents of children with epilepsy. And about 40 families were involved in this study, and we interviewed them and found out about their lived experience of using usually illicit cannabis products with epileptic children. And it was a very difficult path for many of these families. We also combined that with our chemical analysis of the oils that we're using, and found to our surprise, and also to the surprise of the parents, that many of these oils didn't actually contain CBD, which you would expect to be the main anticonvulsant agent in these oils. And quite a lot of them actually contain considerable amounts of THC and THCA as well. And we tried to sort of work out which oils were perceived as effective and which were ineffective, to get a few clues about the best type of oil for treating pediatric epilepsy. And we did what you might call back translation. We looked at what worked in the community, took that back to the lab, and used our animal models to explore what was efficacious. And through that process, uncovered anticonvulsant properties of substances like CBDA, THCA, and CBC that we published. Another major series of work that was led by Nick Linceris. Unfortunately, Nick's next door giving his talk at the moment, which I would love to see, but Nick and Lou Mills have led a series of surveys that we call the Cannabis as Medicine surveys, and that basically tracks cannabis use within the medicinal cannabis community within Australia. And the first two surveys were incredible in showing particularly government agencies that although cannabis was legal, there was desperately few people getting prescribed cannabis. So it was a very useful tool when we went along to give evidence at inquiries to say that the current system needed to be loosened up. And in fact, that's what happened from 2020 onwards. In CAMS 20, we had 38% prescribed, 73% in 22-23. So surveys can be incredibly powerful when they show how the community's missing out. And there's a lot of secondary papers from the CAMS cohort as well. We looked at this cohort in relation to things like sleep disturbance, cannabis use disorder, and driving behaviors as well. So a very rich mine of information, longitudinal information over time from these CAMS surveys. More recently, and just published a couple of weeks ago, we did a study up in the ACT looking at the consequences of the 2020 decriminalization of cultivation, the CANAC study, and that involved 311 cultivators up there that not only we got them to fill out a survey, but we also invited them to give them some of their cannabis so we could analyze it in the lab for THC and CBD content and for pesticides, molds, and heavy metals. And so it was a lot of fun doing this study as well. Again, we had a courier coming down from the ACT every Wednesday, I think, dropping off bags of weed from the cultivators, which was quite nice. And the answer here, that's just the flyer for the survey, the answer here was 9%. The THC being cultivated in the ACT is surprisingly weak, and there's very low CBD content as well. The people expected there to be much more CBD in their cannabis than there actually was. We also looked at terpenes, and I don't know if anyone can make sense of terpene analysis. Please see me after the talk, because you get a lot of interesting, nice chemicals, but the physiological significance of terpenes is something that we still puzzle about. And generally, the cannabis was free of nasties. It adhered quite well to TGO 93 ordinances. There was one sample with a lot of arsenic in it, which we puzzled a little bit about, maybe death by cannabis for someone that didn't like their consumer wife or husband. I don't know. But probably more likely that cannabis is a good bioaccumulator of heavy metals, so if there's a lot in your garden, it may well end up in your weed. So the bottom line of this one was that if you let adults cultivate at home, nothing bad seems to happen. People enjoyed cultivating cannabis. They were growing it often for medical purposes. They really enjoyed not having to deal with illicit networks. The cannabis they were using, they used quite modestly, about 1 gram a day of 9% THC containing cannabis. But most of them found cultivating a little bit of a challenge. A lot of people had problems with plants failing to thrive. Spider mites were mentioned. Some still feared arrest because you're only allowed 2 plants per person there. And then there was wrinkles in the legislation because these 2 plants would usually produce a lot more than 50 grams of dried cannabis, which is the limit that the legislation sets. You can't supply your cannabis to others, but 10% of our cohort were altruistic growers. They were not using the cannabis themselves, they were growing for a family member or a friend. So there's definitely some gray areas in the ACT legislation, and we've had discussions with David Edershank and Jeremy Buckingham and other people about how similar legislation in New South Wales, Victoria, could be enhanced over the ACT legislation. So have a read of that study. It's quite a cool one. I'm quite proud of that little one. Moving on to clinical trials, you confront the essential paradox, which is that in our CAMS surveys, about 90% of patients, or actually 97% in CAMS 22, say that they feel much, much better from using their medicinal cannabis for whatever their condition is, yet the clinical trials often fail to capture that effect. So it's one of the essential paradoxes in the current medicinal cannabis literature. So the way out of that paradox is really to do proper clinical trials, placebo-controlled trials, to show that things actually do work, and you can take that back to doctors. So a few of our big successes, Dave Alsop set this one up early on in the Lambert Initiative with some of the people at the Lifehouse in Sydney. And the question there was a lot of people getting chemotherapy get very sick, they vomit as a result of the chemotherapy and feel very nauseous, and not everyone responds well to the existing antiemetic drugs. So in this clinical trial, they got either placebo or a THC CBD capsule, and we found that there was quite remarkable effects in these treatment-resistant patients in terms of THC having a strong anti-nausea, strong antiemetic effect. And these are the sort of results that change clinical practice. It's really quite a remarkable finding, the first time that this had been done properly in the literature. Another one that I'm really proud of, done in Brisbane with Phil Mosley, Tourette syndrome, a really troublesome neurological condition. People have uncontrollable tics. I gave a talk once to the Tourette's Association. I had 120 tickers in the audience. I'll leave it to you to imagine what that was like. They were all going off round the clock. But it is that you can joke about it, but it's not funny if you have Tourette's syndrome, and existing medications often don't do a particularly good job. In this study, giving THC CBD 1-to-1 up to 20 milligrams per day reduced motor and vocal tics by about 40%. And within that statistic, there are a whole load of people whose lives were transformed by this intervention. They could finally go out in public and not be frightened that they were going to say something inappropriate. Their motor tics were under control and their anxiety was way down. So another big success. This one was pretty amazing as well. So with CBD, we've found that you've really got to go to the upper limits to get good clinical effects. And down in Melbourne with Paul Amminger, we took the most severely anxious young people we could find, people with really severe social phobia, agoraphobia, generalized anxiety, people who couldn't get out the house, and give them an escalating dose of oral CBD. And once we hit 800, remarkable things happened with their anxiety. Both clinician and self-reported anxiety were significantly reduced. Social and occupational function went way up, and concomitant depression disappeared as well. So it's a remarkable result, and points to a way forward with anxiety in young people involving CBD, but you've got to go high. The early doses, 200, 400, nothing much happened. In an ongoing study in anorexia nervosa, we've used the same dosing, CBD 800, in severely anorexic young people, and this study is still in process. If you know anyone that would like to be recruited, then please tell them about it. Our interim analysis suggests a similar thing. We're getting major reductions in anxiety at 800, and the measures of food phobia and so on are also greatly improving. So big result. And anorexia is really interesting. We just did a huge survey, an international survey of more than 5,000 people with an eating disorder, and the third most commonly used drug was cannabis amongst this cohort, and a lot of that cohort were using cannabis daily as well, much more than we actually expected. And apologies for how busy this slide is, but the MedFed survey was really asking, what drugs work for you if you've got anorexia or bulimia or binge eating disorder? And there, in this slide, they've been asked to say, between -2 and +2, how good is this drug for your eating disorder? And the good drugs are shown in blue, and you've got all the cohort in the furthest left column, and then you've got anorexia, bulimia, ARFID, binge eating disorder, et cetera, et cetera. So just look out for the blues. And you find that the blues are not prescription drugs. The blues are cannabis, particularly in anorexia nervosa and ARFID. ARFID is where you basically have a phobia about food, and food tastes like cardboard. So you can imagine how cannabis might improve that condition. Not good for binge eating disorder. You can figure out why that might be. And the other two drugs that really stood out were psilocybin and LSD. So we're deconstructing that data set even further. We've got a lot of cannabis-relevant information and expect a publication on cannabis and eating disorders quite soon, but definitely a strong signal there. Another one that we've just finished is people with spinal cord injuries, given them high-dose CBD, and I can't actually reveal the result yet because the vagaries of closing a clinical trial means that you know that one condition worked before you do the grand reveal and work out which condition it is. But we know that one condition, either placebo or high-dose CBD, has worked really well for neuropathic pain in this population. So the results are on their way, and hopefully it was the CBD that did really well and not the placebo. But something good has happened in that trial, we're pretty sure. Other high-dose CBD trials, we've got trials here in Brisbane in clozapine-resistant schizophrenia, which is the most severe form of schizophrenia that there is. Young people with psychosis, Paul Amminger is doing that trial down in Melbourne. And also we're doing a bigger trial in youth anxiety, the CAN-CAN trial. So there's lots of things going on in this space. What about lower dose CBD? Because very few people are on 800, even 400. Most people are on 100 or 200. And we reviewed the evidence and basically found that there's very little evidence that anything under 400 does anything very useful at all. So it could be that the evidence has just not been discovered yet, but the existing literature doesn't paint a very flattering picture for low-dose CBD. There's a couple of exceptions. Topical CBD is quite interesting, and Zita Bawa, one of our PhD students who recently completed her PhD, did a study of a topical 4% CBD gel in hand osteoarthritis, which seemed to go pretty well. We got reductions in self-reported pain, but we're also doing objective grip strength. These people had a squeezy ball connected to their smartphones, and that gathered data into the cloud, and we got them to squeeze the ball every day, and their grip strength went way up with this 4% CBD topical. So worth thinking of in people who have osteoarthritis. We've tried 150 CBD, as many companies have, it being the magic S3 dose. One study we did, which was a lot of fun, we got students at Griffith Uni to do 2 10-kilometer runs, one with CBD 150 and the other with placebo. I didn't do the run myself, I just sat and watched. It was great to see. And we thought, CBD 150 might make it less painful, they might enjoy the running more, they might run faster, all of these things. We really didn't know what was going to happen, but it was a lovely study. It's not often you can do a clinical trial in 2 days, which is essentially what we did there. But unfortunately, nothing good happened. In fact, CBD 150 looked just like placebo. They all reported pain after the exercise, but CBD didn't take the edge off that pain. And they didn't enjoy the exercise more or run faster. So sorry about that. Again, low dose CBD, we're trying our best to find something, but it might not be there. We have done one really interesting study recently where we used 150 CBD again, and we've been using VR tech to put people in uncomfortable situations. So if you're in this experiment, you go to a wee room, you put the Oculus goggles on, and then we give you a really stressful job interview in the metaverse. And then you have to walk a plank above a sheer drop where you are certain you're going to die. And then we put you in a roller coaster to make you feel sick. So it's a great experiment to be a participant in. And we're just crunching the numbers on this trial. We've tried CBD 150 to see if it reduces anxiety and whether it might be antiemetic as well. And I can't tell you the result yet, but looks like something might have happened. It could be quite exciting. Okay, switching to not CBD or not THC, we've done some work with CBN recently, which has been quite exciting. Our rat study showed us that CBN, cannabinol, which is the oxidative byproduct of THC, if you leave your weed for years, the THC will turn into CBN. Don't smoke it or you'll fall asleep. So CBN in rats was as good as Stilnox or Zolpidem in promoting sleep. That was published late last year, and it prompted a clinical trial led by Camilla Hoyos and Izzy Lavender at the Woolcock Institute, where we got 20 patients. We gave them, they had 3 sleep sessions spaced 2 weeks apart, where they got placebo, 30 or 300 CBN, and we did EEG for objective measures of sleep and also self-reported sleep, and we looked at their driving, their cognitive function, and asked them, do you feel stoned? Because it's an interesting question. We don't know much about CBN. In North America, a lot of people are using CBN from dispensaries for sleep, but there's no really good objective evidence that it works. So it was a labor of love, this trial. It took a long time to organize, but the bottom line was that we got a significant reduction in sleep onset. So on 300 mgs of CBN, people fell asleep much more quickly, which is a great thing. We all know what it's like to toss and turn and not be able to fall asleep. They fell asleep more with CBN, and their self-reported sleep the next morning was much better on CBN 300. There was no effect on the amount of time they spent awake after sleep onset, but that was quite low in this particular cohort. The EEG measures were consistent with better sleep, and when we asked people, even with 300 CBN, do you feel stoned? They said no. We couldn't really see much evidence for any intoxication, and then when we tested their driving and cognitive function the next day, they were pretty good, and they felt great the next day. We got this kind of big surge in mood the next day after 300 CBN. So it's looking really promising. I mean, compared to existing sleep medications, the benzos, the Z drugs, the orexin antagonists, this looks like a very promising set of results. But we have to go high. The current products in the US are usually 20 or 30 mgs of CBN. This suggests you need to go to 300. Okay, a couple of brief sections to finish up. I couldn't finish this talk without mentioning impairment because probably about 20% of Lambert work has been in this field. I never thought I would get into driving research, but the field made me go there. And it's been quite a journey. It's been good fun. Basically, to summarize what we found, CBD does not impair driving. We did a couple of clinical trials just to prove what everyone already knew. We know the timeline for THC impairment in occasional users. We know that regular users are less impaired, and that current roadside and workplace drug tests are very unreliable measures of impairment, even though we do 500,000 nearly roadside tests these days. So the first thing we did back in 2019 was get the police instruments that are used for roadside drug testing into the lab and run a ruler over them, and we found a large number of false negatives and false positives. So these are not reliable instruments that are being used to convict people, and that was quite widely publicized at the time, but didn't actually change practice. And all that happened was the suppliers of these products refused to sell them to the Lambert Initiative after that point. What else happened? We have always asked the question, reviewing the literature, why pick on cannabis? Because if you look at the crash risk with cannabis, it's around about a blood alcohol concentration of 0.02, 0.03, which is legal for most people to drive with, and beneath 0.05, and a lot less than benzos and opioids. Perhaps the most fun clinical trial Lambert ever did was in the Netherlands, where we got people to vaporize cannabis, put them in a Volkswagen, and got them to drive 100 kilometers on normal roads. And that was allowed by the very pragmatic Dutch government, and Tom Arkell led that study. And basically, these were occasional cannabis users, and we were able to show that because the Gulf was full of instruments that measured driving behavior, we found that weaving went up a little bit, a bit like 0.05 of alcohol. Nothing happened when they vaped CBD only. And by 4 hours or so, the effects had dissipated and they weren't impaired anymore. But that was a big result because no one had shown that before with on-road driving. A lot of simulator studies, but not on-road ones. And Danielle McCartney found every study she ever could find on THC impairment and put it together into a mathematical model, which basically shows that if you vape and you're an occasional user, you're probably good to drive 4 hours later, 4 to 6 hours later. With oral products, it's a little bit longer. And this has been very widely cited in medical legal cases because it gives you this window of impairment. Doesn't apply to daily users because they're quite tolerant to impairment effects. We also reviewed everything that was ever written on next day impairment, which is huge for the workplace. If you're vaping cannabis by night, are you good to drive that $20 million mining truck the next day? And basically we found that existing studies, existing data around next day impairment was unreliable, and that in fact our earlier findings of 8 hours maximum duration of impairment applied. So most people using by night are fine the next day. And we've used these data in a number of parliamentary inquiries and to support Jeremy Buckingham in New South Wales calling for an exemption for medical cannabis patients, and they've also been very useful in various medical legal cases involving the workplace. Okay, just the final bit is the new drugs. This is the sexy bit, I think, for me, for the boffin. And cannabis, as we know, is full of bioactive molecules. And what we do at Lambert is isolate them, but also embellish them, play around with their chemical structure to come up with new drugs. And there's 3 areas where we've got really exciting findings and really exciting new drugs in the pipeline. And this is our translational drug discovery team at present who are really cooking and smashing it. First one is worms. C. elegans is the model that's used to investigate longevity. These worms live about 21 days. So if we give them drugs, we can either shorten their lifespan or increase their lifespan. So if we give them CBD, you get about a 20% increase in lifespan. They live maybe 30 days rather than 21. We've been playing around with a lot of different molecules in this model, and we've got one called LI1113, which extends lifespan by 41%, which I think is a world record in this model. And it's a sort of cannabis-inspired molecule. By my calculations, that means I live till I'm 130. So if I have it for breakfast every morning. We know that these cannabinoids are also destroying what's called senescent cells. These are old cells that have stopped dividing and have secrete some various nasty inflammatory factors. The other thing we've been working on is epileptic zebrafish. And you can see these little movements in this 96 well plate. They're little fish having seizures. And we can put drugs in there and find that these seizures are reduced. And the zebrafish are mutated, so they have the same genetic mutation that kids with pediatric epilepsies have. And we've managed to discover 4 molecules that completely abolish epileptic seizures in zebrafish and also in mice models as well. So very exciting. I know I'm overstaying my welcome, so just finally, we also have a couple of molecules in the sleep arena that are even better than CBN. And so this is really exciting as well, and they seem to have no intoxicating effects whatsoever. So it's been a great 10 years, and I'd like to thank obviously the Lambert family for funding this huge body of research and supporting so many Australian researchers. Lucy Haslam for being there, supporting us from the beginning. All my colleagues, particularly Jonathan Arnold and Nick Lintzeris, and all the students, postdoc and research staff and collaborators that have sailed in the good ship Lambert, and also to the wider Australian medicinal cannabis community. Thank you for your time.